Your hero and your villain plays a very important role in your story or film. A very important role. If the difference between your hero and your villain is not shown clearly in your story, in your film, on the screen, if that fight between your hero and your villain is not shown clearly in your film or story, your viewer will have a problem, because they must be able to distinguish clearly between your hero and your villain. Your viewer needs to be able to see on screen what your villain is doing to your hero. And they must be able to see why your villain is doing that. And your hero on the other side need to be actively involved in looking for a solution to stop the villain from doing what he or she wants to do to him or her. If your hero and your villain is not actively involved in your story, you have no story, you have no film. Because your story comes into existence at that point where the villain starts doing things to the hero, and later on when the hero starts fighting back against the villain. That's very important. They must be actively involved in the story. They must be actively involved in doing things. Your hero can't just sit back and say, I have a problem. If your hero do that, there is no story. So, number one, you must ensure that your hero and your villain is actively involved in your story, in your film. The problem that your hero have to deal with in your story must look difficult to solve. And your villain on the other side must want and try to make it even more difficult for the hero to solve that problem. Which means what the villain believes the hero did to him or her must be of such a level that the villain must believe that he or she must really do something to stop the hero, no matter what it is, no matter if they have to sell their soul in order to do so. The same with your hero. Your hero at first might not be willing to do things, might not be willing to stop the villain from doing what he or she is doing, but then must be forced by circumstances that is so difficult that he can't even continue with his or her own life in peace, that they have to make a choice, sink or fly. And that is the point where he or she will have to decide to fight back against the villain. And later on, as things become more and more difficult for the hero to solve that problem, the hero might start thinking about things to do that he or she would not normally do under normal circumstances. In fact, the hero needs to be forced, because of the difficulty of the situation he or she is facing. He or she needs to be forced to do things that he or she would not be willing to do under any circumstance normally. But there's another thing. The question of Are your hero willing to break the law? Are your hero willing to go to jail to save him or herself, believing that there's no other choice? Or would your hero even go so far as to kill the villain because that problem he or she is dealing with is so difficult? But in the end, your hero might also decide it's not worth it to kill that person or to cause that person physical harm, even though he or she is forced to do it. You see, life is about choices. And sometimes choices are forced upon us. Choices are forced upon us that we don't see any other way but to do a certain thing to save ourselves or to save our families. Now, will you be able to commit murder? Ask yourself that question and look at your answer. You might say, no, I probably won't be able to commit murder because I'm a peaceful person. I won't be able to commit murder because I don't like to hurt or harm other people. But are you sure about it? Are you sure that you will never do something to break the law that can get you into serious trouble? You see, that is the dilemma your hero and your villain will probably have to face in your story if your story imitate life. But the problem is so big that there might seem to be no other choice but to commit murder. Can you see here, the bigger the problem is, the more bigger or the more difficult the choices for your hero. And when your hero starts fighting back, the problem for your villain will become bigger, that your villain also need to do everything to stop the hero. That is what makes stories interesting. That is what makes stories something your viewer would want to see. Number one, the choices that your characters have to make. Number two, the extent to which they would go to solve their problem. And if your answer to the question if you would be able to commit murder was no, now I want to ask you, what if you end up in a situation where you seem to have no other choice but to do so to save yourself? Someone is doing something to you or a family member. You went to the police, but the police can't help you because the guy or the woman did not actually break any laws. Even though threats is a cause for alarm, and you can go to the police and open a case at against such a person. But what if that person say you are lying, but that person continues to do the same thing? And now you really feel threatened. The police is not willing to help you, or the police can't help you. Now you are driven to that point where you feel that the only way to save yourself is to kill that person. Life is full of choices, difficult choices sometimes. And your hero and your villain needs to be confronted with such choices. But choices that are more complicated, more intense than you ever had to deal with. A strong villain will lead to an exceptional hero, which means the problem your villain has to deal with personally, his own personal beliefs that the hero is doing something to him, and the hero wants to harm him or her, must force that villain or tell that villain that there's no other way but to fight back against the hero. It might be a false assumption. It might be even someone else that is doing something to the villain. But because the villain believes it's the hero, he attacks the hero. And the hero, when he or she finds out what the villain is doing to them, to what extent will that hero be willing to go to stop that villain? Those are the questions you need to look out for when you write your villain and your hero. How far are they willing to go? The further, the better. But there must be clear reasons for it that your viewer can see on the screen. If they cannot see it on the screen, they will just be confused. Another thing that you have to look at is what type of person is your villain and what type of person is your hero. You have to be able to separate between the two. Their personalities, where they come from, the type of clothing they wear and why they wear it, how they speak, how they behave normally, and how they hold themselves under normal circumstances. For example, your villain might be an ordinary Joe that just finds himself in a certain situation and he don't know how to deal with it. But he finds out that it is caused by your hero. Now, of course he would want to stop that hero. But how? That is the question. And that how might translate into doing something bad to your hero in order to stop your hero, or to force your hero to stop what the villain believes the hero is doing to him or her. Or there might be another motive. For example, the hero might be a person who don't break the law, a person who do something the right way, a person who expect other people to do things in the right way. And now your hero is the boss of the villain at the company for which they work. Now your hero has tackled the villain on many occasions for not doing his or her work properly. But now on the other side, the villain might think, hey, I'm trying my best to do what I need to do, but this guy is not giving me the chance to do so. This guy just don't like me. So what can the villain do? The villain might think of framing the hero for something the hero did not do. You see, there's so many possibilities. All you need to do is think about it. All you need to do is wonder how far both of them would be willing to go. Looking from that point of what type of people they are. That's very important. What type of people these two people are. Not characters. People are in your story. Because your characters are people. People with maybe the same fears that you have, the same needs that you have, the same desires that you have. Wanting to achieve the same things or the same kind of things that you want to achieve in life. And now you also have to look at what is important to them. What is important to the villain? What is important to the hero? Because it is out of those things also that your story will arise. You need to know your characters. You need to know your villain. You need to know what type of person your villain is under normal circumstances, what your villain would do under normal circumstances, and then you must think of what might force your villain to do things that he or she normally would not do. For example, a guy gets fired from his work and he believes he has done nothing wrong. Now he lost his pension also because he was fired. He can't get a job anyplace else because he was fired. And whenever businesses or firms where he applies for work contacts his former employer, they give the information which they believe is right about the villain. And now those people, because of that problem his former employer had with him, don't want to employ the villain. Now the villain gets angry. He believes he is victimized by his former employer and he wants to do something, either to get his pension or to get a new job. And how do we do that? Number one, forcing his former employer to give him his pension, or forcing his former employer to stop giving bad references about him. But how desperate is he? How desperate is he really to get those things? What is he willing to do to get those things? In Speed, you saw a former police officer on the bomb squad start to plant bombs and threatening his former employers that he will blow up certain things if he don't get his pension. You see, desperation can be a really tender trap. Can force you to do things you would normally not be willing to do. But you need such things to make your story interesting. And with such a problem, your hero will have to fight harder against the villain. And that is the point. The harder your hero have to fight to beat the villain, the more interesting your story, your film will be. If you tell your story properly. That's the big if. You can have a big problem caused by the villain. You can have a big problem that needs to be solved by the hero. But the question is, how do your hero go about solving that problem? How do your hero go about fighting the villain? I am Isaac, and this is How to Write a Screenplay, a step-by-step guide. In the next episode, we will continue with looking at your hero and your villain. And we will go into the state of mind that your characters might be in when they find themselves having this big problem they have to deal with. We are people, and as people, something happens in us when certain problems arises in our lives, especially problems that we see as being difficult to solve. Until next time, good writing.